Well, welcome everyone. We're very pleased to welcome Elaine and John to talk today about the SHOCC project and its continuing progress. We've been very privileged to be able to experience this project as it's gone on for the last few years, and the various people involved. There's certainly Jill, who's no longer with us. If she's seeing this, yes, hi Jill. So I mean, there's been a wonderful interdisciplinary group of people involved in a very multi-layered project, which is really kind of cool to see. So I'm quite interested in hearing about this move to 360 video and that just adds one additional dimension to a very exciting project. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Elaine and John, and thanks very much for coming today.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having us. So my name is Elaine Harrington, Special Collections Librarian in UCC Library. My colleague John Hough from the Department of Music. So just to start off, this module began in 2016-2017, and it had already existed on the books at that point with the course code, the title, the description, but it wasn't what it would become over the next 3 years. So together the three of us put our own stamp on this module, and it's from this module that the SHOCC project began. So I'm just going to talk about it briefly, but if you're interested in learning more about how that first iteration progressed, I suggest that you go to the Connell YouTube channel where Jill and I presented on that module, and the slides are also available on my SlideShare. So in 2016 at BALA, which is a conference devoted to instructional technology in libraries and in the GLAM sector, R.D. Lang said, "We should expect more. How will you collect, curate and learn with your most important collection, your community of library members?" And that's what we really found for this project, because we were coming at it from different sectors. We found that it took a community to raise the project off the ground, especially in that first iteration, when I don't want to say we didn't know what we were doing, but we didn't know how we wanted to represent what we wanted to do. So we wanted to explore space, sound, history, and we realized that that wasn't going to work on a paper setting. We needed to move it online. And for that, we came to Digital Humanities, where Sean gave the three of us and the then students a masterclass on representing data visually. We also went to Helen Bradley, then of Geography Department, and she gave the three of us a masterclass on using ArcGIS. So then, how did it work in action? The students came to Special Collections, where most of them had never been to before, learned how Special Collections worked, learned the different type of sources that were there, everything from photographs, maps, almanacs, and the various trade advertisements that were available at the time. I also steered them towards different archival footage that might be available on YouTube, or this really dates the screenshot. It's using Vine, which used to be a feature of Twitter, and of course Vine is no longer present. So the different types of sources that were available. They then went on field recording masterclass with John, one example to Fitzgerald's Park, and then different editing software to create their ArcGIS soundscapes. And it was from this first iteration, that we realized that there was scope for a larger project. And if you watched the Connell YouTube video, Jill and I already at that point in June 2017 have realized that there was this possibility for us to explore. When you have various students in, they're obviously directed to what their own interests are, and we didn't really have the scope to develop what our own interests would be for the module. One of the earliest soundscapes we created were two reflecting the Cork International Exhibition at the early part of the 20th century, and that was specifically because we had seen that source during the first iteration of the module. So we wanted two different parts, one where we would create a series of historical soundscapes, and the second where we wanted to collect sounds of contemporary Cork. Because we had found it so difficult to find sounds at the early part of the 20th century, we wanted to leave a record of sounds of Cork as they are today for future researchers. So that was one part of it. The second was the public engagement. And we realised that the easiest way to do that, and I should say easy, but really it wasn't, was to create an online method for sound collection. We also had to consider, was it worthwhile doing this project? Because what is sound in the city? Is each city different from the next? There are common sounds throughout, sounds with buildings, transport, people walking, weather sounds, snow, rain, etc. So what distinguishes Cork from Dublin? And it's essentially the historical events. So parts of Cork were destroyed during 1920 in the burning of Cork. Parts of Dublin were destroyed during the 1916 rebellion. And it's this which gives each city, we feel, its individual sonic fingerprint. So this is where the Sonic Histories of Cork City came into play, an interdisciplinary research project between then members of the Department of Music and UCC Library. It investigated different sounds across time and space using the archival sources in a similar manner to how the music module worked. And we wanted to combine the textual and sonic sources to redefine what we meant by the historical record. We wanted to engage with Cork's public through the soundscapes, various events, and the tool that we would later term SoundCatcher, both to inform other people of what we felt was a slightly overlooked aspect to the city, but also to learn from other people's experience with the different parts of the city. Equally important was the methods for sound collection, analysis and mapping, and for this I'm going to hand you over to John.
Thanks, Elaine. So I got initially dragged into the project. The SHOCC project's a bit of a black hole, and Jill asked me to do some field recording workshops with the students. But when I heard about this idea of historically informed soundscapes, what immediately came to mind was a series of clips I saw on the British Film Institute's website. Has anyone come across these before? There's a whole host of these clips which form part of the Mitchell and Kenyon collection. And Mitchell and Kenyon were these early documentary filmmakers, and they were commissioned to come over to Cork in 1902 to document the Great Exhibition. So luckily for us, they also went around the city and recorded various scenes they came across. So it's just a great resource for historians, you know, looking at the Edwardian period. So I'm going to play you a 20-minute clip here, and hopefully that will take up the rest of the presentation. I know it's only a minute long, well, a minute and a half. So. Can you all recognize the scene or the places there? Yeah. So yeah, like my initial reaction to seeing these short films was like, well, obviously what's missing from this film? Sound. So yeah, I started just thinking about how did Cork City sound. Obviously it's a lot different nowadays, but it's still a very kind of bustling, vibrant city without, but perhaps without all the motor traffic that we'd have today. So I thought it'd be a really good entry point into the Sonic Histories project to create a sound design which would accompany, you know, to kind of reanimate it as such. So how do we go about creating a soundscape from the past? So R. Murray Schafer, he basically wrote the book on soundscapes, and he breaks down the soundscape into these kind of different components. So you've keynote sounds, these are background sounds which are usually heard unconsciously. I mentioned Kent Station there because I lived for years in St. Luke's, and the murmur of the train station is just always there in the background. Usually the ear tunes out these types of sounds, apart from like the odd morning when you wake up at 4 a.m. you can hear the diesel engines kicking off. There's also sound signals. These are more foreground sounds. They have more semantic meaning for us. So, you know, anything from the ding of a bell of a tram or a bicycle or an ambulance or a dog bark, things like that. They alert us to what's happening around us. And then sound marks then are more, I suppose, location specific. So I mentioned Shandon Bells there would be a really iconic sound mark for that area, and each part of the city then might have different sound marks. So in the case where we have a silent film as our primary source, it's perhaps a lot easier when we have visual cues to work with. Although when looking at each object as, you know, a sound event, and also considering the geographic environment and, you know, outside of what we see on screen, you can end up going down a bit of a rabbit hole trying to consider all the different sound sources that might be there. The soundscape model for me draws a lot of parallels with how film soundtracks are constructed and broken down. So when looking to create a historical or period piece soundscape, my initial inspiration was to draw on film sound design, which I have some background experience in, and particularly looking at period films. So for those of you unfamiliar with how a film soundtrack is typically constructed, I robbed this nice image. It's basically like 3 branches. So you have music, you've got your score obviously, and then source music, which might be music happening within the scene. Then dialogue, again you have your production sound, so that's your actors are recorded on set. Sometimes they'll have to be brought into the studio, and they do this process called ADR where they re-record their lines. So, you know, in the Marvel films where there's loads of like effects going off, it's actually nearly impossible to record the actors on set. So they'll replace all the lines in a studio. You'll also have walla, which is kind of a weird term, but that refers to all the background human sounds. So any murmuring, if you can imagine a restaurant scene, you know, where you have 2 characters, there's lots of kind of murmuring and activity in the background. So again, that would be recorded in a studio, or they might use like libraries of sound effects. And then the other branch is our sound effects. So you've got your backgrounds, again, which is like your keynote sounds. They create the acoustic reality of the scene. Foley then, if we can think about our clip there with all the pedestrians walking around. So Foley is basically footsteps, movements, things like that. And then you've got like practical and design effects. So that's where the sound designer or the director is trying to guide the viewer by directing them to certain events on screen as they happen. So now you've had a tutorial on film sound. I'm going to step into the realm of Hollywood for a moment, and they're essentially using the same techniques we're using in the SHOCC project. They're drawing on primary sources for ideas and inspiration. So that guy on the left is Richard King, so he was the sound supervisor on what's his name? Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk. So again, a period film. And Richard King would have researched first-hand written accounts of survivors, which he says himself were really orally descriptive. So the language they used, you know, he used that to inspire the soundtrack. As an example, for creating the bombing raid sequences on the beach, they went about sourcing Stuka sirens. So these are the iconic bombers used in World War II by the Germans. But they couldn't get their hands on any, so they ended up building approximated versions of these sirens and bringing them and recording them in the desert where all good sound effects are recorded. So I'll play this little example just to give you an idea of this process. You're not hiding under the tables right now in fear, but yeah, it's really dramatic stuff. So going back to our silent film, one starts to consider all sorts of questions like what type of footwear were the people wearing, how did they sound, on the pavement, what music might have been playing on Shandon bells at the time, how did the various trams and horse carriages sound. What activity was occurring in the port, and were the Echo Boys in operation at that time running around selling newspapers? I think they were actually. But these all contribute to the sonic fingerprint of the city at the time. So as we've seen in the movie, sound designers will often go to great lengths to recreate sounds of long past objects and events. But without film-sized budgets, we have to use creative interpretation a lot of the time, and at the end of the day, with these historical soundscapes, we're trying to tell a story, and because sound can embody so much emotion, we often have to heighten or dramatize the sound in order to make it more impactful. So you kind of have this tug of war between kind of the subjective actuality of what's happening in the scene versus the storytelling, the story you want to communicate. So I'm just going to play the same clip now, but with a composed soundscape. So I'm not sure if I mentioned, this was actually filmed from a tram ride. You know, it's not an actual drone shot. So in reality, what you probably would have heard there was just the sound of a tram car going. So we're using a creative interpretation of the scene. So hopefully you can see how useful this process is in not only reanimating a piece of silent film, but also kind of questioning, you know, how our cities once sounded and how the sonic fingerprint of Cork is changing. So as part of the sound studies module, I conducted workshops in field recording and sound editing with the students, and the purpose of the workshops was twofold basically. We wanted to encourage them to document sonically Cork City of the present, and we also wanted to equip them with the tools and techniques to allow them to go off and create their own historically informed soundscapes. So I basically show them different recording techniques and different types of microphones. The one there on the left, for example, is a contact mic, and that's attached to a sewing machine and Singer's sewing shop where one of the students did a soundscape on. The other mic it's a shotgun microphone, so it's used for trying to isolate sounds. So once the students are versed in the approaches to sound recording, we then bring them on sound walks where we explore the soundscapes of the city and get them used to the practicing of listening to the city, but using the microphone as the medium and a pair of headphones. Because wearing headphones and pointing the mic is quite an insightful experience, because you start to hear and notice sounds you wouldn't typically pay any attention to. As ethnographer Stephen Feld describes it, the practice of field recording presents an enhanced way of listening to people, places and objects. So once we get back into the studio, then we look at techniques for editing and constructing soundscapes using audio editing software, usually cheap and free ones like Audacity and Reaper. So as Elaine mentioned earlier, another important part of the jigsaw puzzle is the ArcGIS GIS platform, which we got great help with from Helen Bradley, and even with Helen's help, there's a lot to learn about using that application behind the scenes, basically. So using ArcGIS, we take historical maps. Here's one from the 18th century, and we geo-reference them onto accurate grid reference maps. You can see that the two layers there, you've got your kind of modern map underneath with all the streets. So once we kind of get these different maps set up, we then give the students access to them, and they use the Story Maps platform then to kind of present their research outcomes. So this is just a simple example showing changes in bird populations. You know, as urban development continues, you know, certain types of birds are pushed out of the city, and that in turn affects how the city sounds. So SHOCC began as a university-based project, but we're engaging with the city and the wider community through events where we encourage the public to join in on sound walks and use their mobile phones as sound recording devices. They're not the best tool, but everyone has one. So as Elaine mentioned as well, the SoundCatcher app it's a simple web app basically that sits on our website, and it allows users to upload geotagged recordings and accompanying descriptors, tags and images, etc. And these are then, this is just some of the example of some of the data that is uploaded with each sound. So we basically curate sound walks, and we bring people, you know, around the city, and they can use their phones then to upload sounds. And then again, we use Google Maps to map, take this data, which is all stored on Google Drive and through Excel spreadsheets, and we map it then on a Google Map. So this is interactive. You can go in and click on various points and listen to those sound recordings. So we're hopeful that these might be used by future sound historians, maybe. So now I'll hand you back to Elaine, who will talk through some of the students' soundscapes.
Thanks, John. So the first soundscape I want to look at is one from the English market, which from the late 18th century to the early 19th century, market moved indoors. And it's quite a short piece, so I'm just going to play it in its entirety. Where do you think we went? So this is why when you present on Google Chrome, it's whoopsie. So that first soundscape, the student recorded it in the current English market. She took pains to eliminate all of the sounds of the modern world, so any cars, any mobile phones. John mentioned authenticity. I don't actually know what early 19th century Cork people would have sounded like, but by and large, all you can hear, thank you, John, is kind of murmuring, apart from a few repeated good mornings. Whether it actually sounded like that is something else. So then the second one is from last year's cohort of students, and he followed a cart coming down Chandon Street, going across the Northgate Bridge, and then into the medieval spine of the city. Which was the then main street, and so a highly bustling space. And this is really long, so I'm actually going to jump in at a later point. So this is just as he's crossing the bridge. Then as he crosses the bridge and enters, the soundscape changes from just the noise of the cart to very little noise. There's the river and then the bustling. And then the final one is one that John and I created, trying to recreate the 19th century Queen's College Cork Library. I included this time because this year, 2020, is the 175th anniversary of the founding of the university. The library as it was in the 19th century is based in the space now occupied by the common room and the council room, the false floor put in later. But we wanted to see if we could get the double height of the space. So for this we went to the Max, which has that still in place. We thought about different things. So John was going to be recording, so I was the guinea pig walking around. We wondered about different shoes, so I tried to get shoes that didn't have plastic, because obviously that wouldn't have been there in the late 19th century. It would have been male students predominantly in the college, so I lengthened my stride, and John then recorded me walking in different areas around. So those were some of the considerations we had. I'm again going to jump in later because you'll hear the early part at a different point. If you're familiar with Hough, John, all books are good. If you're familiar with 19th century paper, you know that it sounds completely different to 21st century paper. And from the records of the time, anyone using the library complained that it was too cold, it was never open enough, there weren't enough seats, and there weren't enough books, which I think are common complaints still today, so very little has changed. So then with each different group of people who worked with the project, they each brought a different facet and contribution. Because it was linked to a university module, we felt that the module would have sustainability, and we realised that it was a good example of the university's connected curriculum. Through the entry point of sound, ultimately 4 different MA programmes would contribute across Digital Humanities and the music department. And because there were different research interests in play, we got a wide range of soundscapes that were all available on the website. From different events, we got different engagement through UCC Sound Day, so people who were solely interested in sound, Cork Discovers, and Culture Night. Again, different members of the community focusing on different things. But one of the feedback we got was, at the time, many of our soundscapes were designed for an adult audience. So you had public executions or Magdalene laundries, and they're not exactly child friendly. So we asked for a suggestion, and the skateboard park at the foot of the Mardyke was given. And this was a really interesting place for us because it had the Cork Athletic Grounds, the now Mardyke Arena, the cricket ground, and even the Mardyke itself, which was formed at the early part of the 19th century, showing the Dutch influence of Cork City. So we went to the skateboard park and recorded it. And this shows up then as one of our social media walks that John has mentioned earlier, where we go to different locations and bring them on different guided tours. And we find that while presentations can be really useful, ultimately it's the hands-on participation, which is what we did for UCC Sound Day 2, where we had a 20-minute introductory presentation recommending different recording devices to use. And then we took any of the participants on a guided sound walk of the medieval spine, because there's quite a lot available on North Main Street and then the surrounding Central Island. But what we found through analysis of statistics, everybody ends up doing statistics at some point, is that 38 different countries have had people look at our website, and we figure that they can't all be bots. There have to be some real people out there. We realise that not everybody can come to Cork, so we've tried to look at different ways to showcase what we do and the different layers of history. So I'm going to use this example of Cork's Emmet Place. So the building on the far right with its early 21st century add-on is Cork Opera House, but it used to look like the building on the far right hand side of the postcard, which burned in 1955. If we go one building in from the photograph, we have the Crawford Art Gallery, which was at one point the Crawford College of Art and Design, and before that it was the Royal Cork Institution, forerunner to third level education in Cork, and before that again it was Cork's first custom house. And if we go one building over, we see what is now housing Starbucks, but at one point it was a merchant's house in 19th century Cork, and in the attic the artist Daniel MacLeese used to paint. So within each building you have different layers of sound through different time periods, but also how they interact with each other in the same space. And to do that, we wanted to find a way to do it. And we'll be discussing in upcoming blog posts next week, intent, that when we said we were going to do virtual reality, realistically we probably bit off more than we could chew. If you were here last semester, Dave Murphy gave a really interesting presentation on that. So we settled instead for 360-degree tours. So, nope. Whoops. So this is the first part of the recording, and I'll talk more about it after. So we've taken the recording that John and I had created for the original Queen's College Cork Soundscape, and we've divided it into different parts. So the first part, just solely as somebody comes along the quad, along the gravel, and then comes through the flagstones. Well, you can't come through flagstones. It goes along the flagstones and then enters the library, and then it cuts off and you move to the next part, and there will be a sound clip for the next part of it as well. We found that this was the easiest way for what our technological expertise would allow us to do. And we could add then different images, trying to layer that up as we needed to. But because we had found it so difficult to source sounds for the early part of the 20th century, we wanted to also preserve the different sounds that we have. And we've looked at different ways to do this. We know that internet memory has cultural vacuum and the loss thereof, and you see that in projects like Documenting Ferguson. We don't know yet how information may yet be used, so 19th century ship's logs are now being used to look at climate change. All of the web pages on the WordPress site are backed up on the Wayback Machine. We use Martin Hawkes's tags for social media documentation. We investigated archive it pretty much at the same time that UCC Library did, but it requires a considerable cash injection and we don't have a budget, so that's that. So we're also then looking at a data management plan, whereas all of our information that's published is freely available on our website. Any of the other data that we've collected is, as John mentioned, on Google Drive. So we're looking to make a way for that to be more accessible. Our working archive, again, everything is backed up on Google Drive, but because Google has a history of decommissioning parts of it, I am still gutted about Google Reader. We want to make sure that everything is available at some point. But we know that everything has had a research impact, so we were nominated for and shortlisted for 2 different awards. And in relation to the education awards, we felt that we should submit an application for a number of reasons. We were combining archival sources and creating historical soundscapes. We were focusing as well on a collection of contemporary sounds, and whereas other projects were doing similar activities, they were focusing on particular sounds, whereas we were encompassing everything. So Dublin, the Mapping Popular Music, was focusing on popular music. Limerick Soundscapes was only looking at contemporary sounds, and we wanted to kind of museumify the city, as it were. And Wellington and Melbourne are doing similar things, but both of their systems were designed for iOS only, whereas we wanted anyone to be able to access it on any platform. So what we think is we've created an accidental digital humanities project. We didn't set out to do this, but this is what has happened. We have research, we had up until Jill left, research-driven pedagogy. We were grounding everything in archival sources. We were publicly engaging through a series of events. We have created, through the medium of sound, text, and words, a project where there's a portal to the past, not just for us, but for future generations. So we'd like to acknowledge all of the people who have participated in the project, and we're happy to take any questions.